Hey everyone, Jared Ellis here. I'm excited to be on Preaching Forward with you. Today I want to talk about preaching from your prayer life. A lot of times as preachers, communicators, and leaders, we find ourselves so busy and in such high demand. Many of you are preaching multiple times a week, not just on Sundays, but you're teaching your leaders and your staff and constantly in front of volunteers. And how do we live a life in ministry where we are living a vibrant place out of prayer and consecration to God? I remember when I was a student pastor in Abilene, Texas, I lived in a small apartment, didn't have much room for a barbecue setup, but I love to grill. So I bought myself a Weber charcoal grill, small little one that could go on the ground, and put those charcoals in there and lit it on fire. For those of you who've ever used a charcoal grill, you know that it takes time for those coals to heat up to a place where they can properly grill something. But if you're like me, you don't have a lot of patience. And so I decided to take a bunch of lighter fluid and pour it on that fire and watch that fire erupt. And while the flames were high, I threw the piece of steak that I had bought on that grill. Watched it sizzle underneath the fire. Just the smell alone made me salivate. Was ready to put that thing on my plate. About 10 minutes later, cut into that steak, put it into my mouth. And let me just tell you something. It was the absolute worst piece of meat I have ever had in my life. It tasted like lighter fluid. It was disgusting. And I realized in that moment that if I would have just taken the extra time to let those coals permeate with the heat that they needed to grill that steak, maybe I wouldn't have wasted $15 of my money on a piece of meat that I ended up having to throw out. But instead, I took shortcuts to use artificial things that really didn't create a product that was worth having. I feel as preachers and leaders in our lives, it's easy to do this. It's easy to use artificial things that can spruce up our sermons and our messages, but really true passion and conviction comes from the place of prayer. And I find this in the secret place that Jesus talks about when he's giving his famous sermons. Also, we find it in David's life. David spends the majority of his time in the pasture with sheep, but it's in that secret place in worship with the Lord that he's anointed to be king. It's also the place we find Mary in when she is told that she's going to receive the Son of God in her womb. She ponders those things in her heart in the secret place. And lastly, we find it in Nehemiah's life. And that's really what I want to focus in on today. Nehemiah finds out that the walls of Jerusalem are broken down. And like a preacher, he identifies a problem and knows that he needs to communicate a solution. But I want to identify his response to the problem. It says, "So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept, mourned for many days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven and earth." This is what I want to challenge us with today. Is our first response when we see a problem or we receive a sermon to go to our Evernote file of illustrations and sermon ideas, or is it to be driven into the secret place? It's only in the secret place that the power and the fire of God's presence, like those charcoals in that grill, can be surrounded with the heat of God, wisdom and revelation, marinating in his presence, so that the product that we offer is something that actually can change the world. I remember as a Bible school student, when I was called to be a young preacher, I didn't have a message. I would go to the house of prayer and I would spend time in God's presence, allowing his Holy Spirit to move me so that when I stood up on that stage, I had some substance because I had spent time with God. My question for you is, how's your prayer life? You can create great illustrations and great techniques to create great sermons. But I'm really going to ask you, like Nehemiah, have you wept recently for the message that God has put on your heart? Have you toiled over the sermon? Have you spent time with God? Nehemiah didn't just stop there. It says after days of mourning and weeping, he went around the city, not telling people what he was going to do, but instead he consulted the culture and he asked God, what was the strategy for how you want to bring a solution to this problem? We cannot afford in this hour just to come up with great sermons. We really need the Holy Spirit to fill our lives with his presence and fill our messages with substance. There's a famous preacher that said, "Light me on fire and let the world watch me burn." I pray that as preachers and communicators, we can allow God's presence first to transform us before we ever ask him to transform those we're willing to preach to. God, start with me. God, change me first. And I truly believe that it's in the place of prayer that you will find consecration, conviction, and ultimately great communication so that you can change the world around you. Thanks so much for letting me be with you. I hope that this blessed and encouraged you, and I hope that you take this and today go spend some time in your prayer closet with the Lord. and allow the fire of his presence to consume you with a message that will shake you and then shake the world.